On December 13th, 2011, a veterinarian rushes home because his wife isn't answering the phone.
He discovers his wife's bloody body in the bathtub.
The first responders certify the death and conclude that 62-year-old Michelle Laforge committed suicide.
He saw a hairdryer in the water that was connected to the outlet.
But the victim's loved ones reject the suicide theory.
For me, it was unthinkable.
She loved life. She was full of life.
An investigation is opened, and very soon, foul play is suspected.
Since some jewelry has disappeared, it means there's been a robbery. If someone robbed the apartment, surely they killed her.
The victim's maid is accused of the murder.
I'm convinced she didn't do it. She could not have.
Who had a grudge against Michelle Laforge?
There was tension in their relationship.
They argued, they bickered, but that's par for the course for everyone. That doesn't mean he killed his wife.
Is it possible that the victim's fiery character led to the murder?
My mother was hot-blooded, Mediterranean. When she had something to say, she didn't mince her words.
Jean-Marc Bloch, former head of the Versailles Police Department, and Negar Aedi, criminal lawyer, will join us as we look back on this case. We're in the 15th arrondissement of Paris, on the left bank of the Seine. It was here that on December 13th, 2011, Michelle Laforge, an apparently ordinary 62-year-old woman, was found dead in her bathtub. The first responders initially thought she had committed suicide, but the Paris Crime Squad quickly established that it was murder. In this investigation, the victim's maid was suspected before finally being acquitted. Since then, the identity of Michelle Laforge's killer has remained a mystery. We're looking back at a case that remains unsolved to this day. It's lunchtime on Tuesday, December 13th, 2011. In the 15th arrondissement of Paris, Hervé Laforge, a 61-year-old veterinarian, has finished his morning appointments. He leaves his clinic on Rue Saint-Charles and heads to a restaurant where he's a regular.
He had arranged to meet his wife, Michelle Laforge, at the Bistro Champêtre restaurant for lunch around 1 p.m. He was waiting for his wife, and out of the blue, a friend called him, who usually had lunch in the area, and came to join Hervé Laforge.
The two men have a drink while waiting for Michelle Laforge, but the clock is ticking, and the vet's wife still hasn't arrived. However, the pet supply store she manages is just over 100 yards away. Convinced she won't be much later, the two friends place their orders.
Hervé Laforge isn't particularly concerned until he calls his wife on her cell phone and she doesn't answer.
Why is Michelle Laforge not answering her phone? Her silence is very unusual. She usually contacts her husband several times a day, or even several times an hour. At 2:30 p.m., Hervé Laforge receives a phone call from his wife's store. But on the other end is the young store assistant who's surprised not to have seen Michelle Laforge all morning.
And that's when he really starts to worry, faced with this silence that's becoming deafening.
At the age of 62, Michelle Laforge is in fragile health, so her husband immediately fears that she's become unwell at their home.
She had hip problems and she had had surgery, so Michelle Laforge is liable to suddenly lose her balance to such an extent that she would be unable to get up on her own.
Hervé Laforge and his friend cut their lunch short and leave the restaurant a little before 3 p.m. They have less than 450 yards to walk to reach the apartment on Rue Ginot.
When Mr. Hervé Laforge talks about arriving at his apartment, he says flat out that he opened the door, which was locked.
When he enters the apartment, the vet notices that his wife's keys are in the keyhole, so he thinks his wife is there.
He called his wife, and needless to say, there was no answer.
Hervé Laforge goes from room to room. Michelle is not in the living room, the kitchen, or the bedroom. The vet then pushes the bathroom door open.
He discovers his wife's bloody body in the half-full bathtub, and everything falls apart.
Half-dressed, Michelle Laforge is lying on her back, motionless. This vision is unbearable for her husband, who has been with her almost 17 years. Hervé Laforge can only stand and stare at his dead wife.
He quickly thought it was suicide since he saw a hairdryer in the water that was connected to the outlet.
Devastated, Hervé Laforge thinks his wife has taken her own life. He doesn't believe it's an accident because he knows his wife never takes baths. Hervé Laforge's friend, who witnessed the discovery of the body, goes down to alert the building's janitor and tells him to call the emergency services. The latter then calls the 15th Arrondissement Police Station, paramedics, and the fire department. Meanwhile, Hervé Laforge, the victim's husband, waits in the apartment. At 3:28 p.m., firefighters from the Grenelle fire station are dispatched to the scene. They already know that the victim is in a bathtub with a plugged-in hairdryer in the water. So before intervening, they must remove any risk of electrocution.
When the firefighters arrive, and they're very familiar with the procedure, the first thing they do is cut the power supply and the circuit breaker. Afterwards, they also use a rod to check there's no voltage in the bathtub.
With the help of a rod equipped with a diode, the firefighters check the bathwater for an electric current. The test is negative. The danger is over. The paramedic who has just arrived looks at Michel Laforge's body and confirms that nothing more can be done. The victim is dead. As a precautionary measure, the firefighters extract the hairdryer from the water. However, Michel Laforge still clenches in her right hand the device's curled-up power cord.
Both the firefighters report rigor mortis at that moment, to such an extent that one of them says he had to undo the hairdryer cord that was embedded in Michel Laforge's fingers. He had to move each finger to extract the cord.
For the first responders, this clenching is characteristic of electrocution.
The firefighters' first reaction is that this is suicide. One of them insists because he came across an identical scene in his career a few years earlier. So he's immediately convinced that this is suicide by electrocution in light of the hairdryer in the bathtub.
The first responders, like the victim's husband, are under the impression that Michel Laforge took her own life. The police officers of the 15th Arrondissement then alert the deputy prosecutor on duty, who comes to the scene. This magistrate immediately calls the Paris Criminal Police. At 7:50 p.m., officers from the headquarters of the Paris police arrive on the scene, accompanied by forensic technicians. They start making their first findings. When they enter the apartment, the police notice several small marks on the floor. Their round shape suggests that they may be footprints left by the Laforge's cat. But after checking, the cat's paws and coat are clean. The forensic technicians then go into the bathroom.
Mrs. Laforge's body is positioned in the bathtub in a very particular way. Her head is completely submerged in the water. Her legs are crossed at the ankles. She's half dressed in leather pants and a bra that's pulled up above her breasts.
Michel Laforge's head is under the bathtub faucet. Her legs are bent. Her knees are out of the water. Her arms rest on her stomach and chest. She is wearing costume jewelry on her wrists, her wedding ring, her watch, but only one earring in her right ear. The forensic technicians observe no signs of a struggle.
They find her missing earring on the floor. There's also a small basin containing Mrs. Laforge's underwear.
The investigators find the hairdryer in the sink where the firefighters placed it after pulling it out of the water. The object is sealed and sent for analysis. The body is extracted from the bathtub.
When they take out Michel Laforge's body, they make a rather interesting discovery. At the back of her head, there's a serious wound, 1.5 inches long and fairly deep.
This wound is undoubtedly the cause of the red coloration of the water. Traces of blood are also found on the bathtub faucet. Is it possible that Michelle LaForge injured herself on the spout of the faucet? A sample of the bathwater is taken, but analysis doesn't offer any answers.
When the bath is emptied after the body has been extracted, there's another interesting discovery. At the bottom of the tub, there's a hairbrush.
At this time, nothing explains how or why this hairbrush ended up at the bottom of the bathtub under Michelle LaForge's body. The police officers then inspect the rest of the apartment. In the couple's room, the bed is unmade. There's a pair of pantyhose on the sheets. The police officer's attention then turns to some surprising photographs.
Photographs of Michelle Laforge's mother's funeral, which Hervé Laforge didn't see that same morning.
Why would Michelle LaForge display photos of her mother on her deathbed? In the living room, the investigators discover another macabre document, a description of the procedures to follow in the event of the death of a relative. Could Michelle LaForge have left these instructions for her husband?
Then there's not much else. There's no note from Miss LaForge to explain anything.
Her husband is stunned. The same morning, when he left his home around 8:45 a.m., he didn't notice anything unusual about his wife's behavior. The police decide to seize the victim's computer. They write in their report that there are no signs of a break-in at the apartment.
Knowing that there are no signs of a break-in, they're interested in the people who have keys. There are 4 sets of keys. A set of keys for each of the LaForges, one which the maid has, and a set kept for when the grandchildren come over. A set that's found.
The set of keys for Mr. and Mrs. LaForge's 2 grandchildren is found in the drawer in the kitchen. As for the 4th and last set of keys, it's in the possession of Lamia, the maid.
Lamia is questioned by the police, and she explains that she didn't come that day because she was sick. She talked to Miss LaForge on the phone the day before and told her then that she wouldn't come that day.
In the office, the police discover a notebook in which Michelle LaForge records Lamia's workdays. Her last visit is dated the previous Friday, 4 days before the tragedy. The police come to the end of their inspection.
All the usual ingredients, all the clues pointing to violence or a fight, there's none of that. No signs of a break-in, no signs of violence.
At 1 a.m., the police investigators and the forensic technicians leave the scene. The apartment is cordoned off. Hervé Laforge goes to sleep at his veterinary clinic, convinced that his wife has committed suicide. Jean-Marc, you worked at the police headquarters in Paris. Is it common for officers from the crime squad to be called in to inspect a scene that's been branded suicide by the first responders?
No, things didn't happen exactly like that. In reality, it happens in several stages. When the emergency services intervene, for example at an apartment, and discover a death that seems suspicious, they must notify the police at the nearest police station. The police station in turn notifies the public prosecutor, who, depending on the information received, calls in the force that seems the most suitable to lead the investigation. Here, in this case, if the deputy prosecutor is calling in the crime squad, it's because he thinks it could be a homicide. No matter what the firefighters believe, who, based on their own experience, think it's suicide, it's the police's job to consider all theories.
The forensic technicians took all the necessary samples and the police investigators inspected the entire apartment in search of any clues. What can we learn from these initial findings?
The investigators have identified everything they consider to be problematic. And although they haven't found any clues that prove a third party was in the apartment, they noticed several things that could cast doubt on the suicide theory. First, what was that hairbrush doing under the victim's body at the bottom of the bathtub? bathtub. It's hard to imagine Michel Laforge trying to commit suicide with a hairbrush in one hand and a hairdryer in the other. Secondly, both the missing earring and the bra, raised above the breasts, suggest the body was moved, meaning a third party was involved.
And what do you think of the photos found in the bedroom and the document about the procedures to follow in the event of death? On the face of it, these things suggest suicide.
No, not necessarily. I find this display almost too conclusive. There's something rather odd, like it was staged.
When the police officers got to the apartment at 7:50 p.m., it had already been over 4 hours since the body was discovered, and various emergency services had intervened. The scene had therefore been contaminated. Is that a problem?
Of course, but this happens in many cases. We can't ask the emergency services to do nothing. They need to certify the death and make sure the victim is dead and that nothing more can be done. What we can criticize the firefighters for in this case is that they removed the hairdryer from the victim's hands before a photo had been taken. A photo would have made it possible to see the scene as a whole. The victim in the bathtub with the hairdryer in her hands would have been more telling.
At this stage of the investigation, nothing is certain. Was it suicide, an accident, or even homicide? The crime squad will now try to get a clearer picture of Michel Laforge. The police want to know everything about the victim to try and understand the circumstances of her death. In the early hours of the investigation, Michel Laforge's mailbox provides the investigators with a disturbing piece of evidence. On the morning of the tragedy at 9:14 a.m., a letter with the heading "Suicide" was sent to her.
She receives it from friends, it seems, with whom she shares a kind of esoteric philosophy.
Several details in this message capture the police officer's attention. The letterhead and the signature are in code. These are initials used by Freemasons. My dearest brothers and sisters. Each letter is doubled when addressing several members. Michel Laforge, therefore, belonged to a Masonic lodge.
When it comes to her commitment to Freemasonry, I think she was sincere. I'm sure of it. She really appreciated being able to discuss social issues. She was serious about the philosophy, and she formed strong friendships.
This letter is far from an incitement to suicide. It's quite the opposite. It's about the guilt we feel when a loved one commits suicide, and how to help fragile people before they do anything.
The letter's content is very specific, since it refers to a member of the lodge who died.
The police try to understand why Michel Laforge displayed photos of her mother's funeral, who died 4 years earlier. How did she deal with her grief?
When she saw her mother getting old, it was very painful for her. Because when we see our parents getting older, we know that we are going to get older, and inevitably, we identify with the person of the same sex.
At 62, Michel Laforge had a hard time with the aging process. While questioning her relatives, the police investigators learned that she was experiencing serious and debilitating health problems.
Mom was a fighter. She was brave. But at the end of her life, she had serious health problems. She had dialysis every fortnight. What's more, she had significant mobility issues, problems walking and hip problems.
Could the prospect of losing her independence have driven Michel Laforge to suicide?
Impossible. It's just impossible. It's not even conceivable. She had such a will that even if she was suffering or in pain, she didn't show it. Truly.
Over the course of the interviews, Michel Laforge's loved ones paint a portrait of a woman full of life.
She was cheerful, very cheerful. Funny. One thing that really stood out was her physical appearance. She was absolutely radiant, and she knew it. She loved it. She had quite a few flings, unlike me, who had very few.
My mom was a very funny and cheerful woman. She loved to laugh. No one laughed like her. She loved life, and she was full of life.
She was always a bit on the edge of the forbidden, daring to do the forbidden. It was funny.
Michel Laforge always lived her life without worrying about what others thought.
She wasn't that interested in school, so she took up hairdressing, and it seemed to suit her very well. And then after she got pregnant with Virginia, she was supposed to get married. She didn't get married.
A single mother, she entrusted her daughter's upbringing to her parents to have time to build a solid future for herself.
She was ambitious. She did everything to get where she wanted to be. She lived with someone who owned an African art gallery in the heart of Paris. And she made a living from the art market.
In 1984, at the age of 46, she married Hervé Laforge, a renowned veterinarian. At the time, this distinguished specialist in feline ophthalmology headed one of the most prominent veterinary clinics in the capital. Michel Laforge left the art world to run a pet supply store.
They met on a barge at a party in Paris, and they got married very quickly. And yes, I think they were happy.
For her, it was a beautiful marriage. She was very happy. She was living the dream, absolutely living the dream.
The couple shone. They traveled and entertained. They were a happy couple.
The police now know about Michel Laforge's life. It seems that only her husband believes she committed suicide. The day after Michel Laforge's death, on December 14, 2011, her body was autopsied at the Paris Forensic Institute. Nagar, who decides on this investigative measure, and is it automatic in the event of a violent death?
When the cause of death can't be established with certainty, and this is generally the case with violent deaths such as suicides or accidents, an autopsy may be requested. And in this case, as it's the start of an investigation led by the public prosecutor, he's the one who makes the request.
When you lose a loved one in these circumstances, it's obviously terrible. Then learning that an autopsy is going to be performed is often unbearable. Can the victims' families object to the autopsy?
The judicial autopsy is an investigative measure that is useful to establish the truth. So unfortunately, the families can object. On the other hand, because this measure is obviously extremely painful for the family, the penal procedure regulates the autopsy by decreeing, for example, that the body be returned as soon as possible, with the best possible condition, and that the families can have access to it before it's placed in a coffin, under conditions guaranteeing respect and dignity. And in general, the families eventually understand the autopsy is a necessary investigative measure.
In this case, the medical examiner must determine the causes and circumstances of Michel Laforge's death. The police officers from the Paris Crime Squad hope the autopsy will be able to establish with certainty whether or not the death was a result of foul play. The autopsy begins with an external examination of the body. The medical examiner observes 5 hematomas on the victim's arms. He specifies that these bruises happened at the time of death and are compatible with collisions against flat surfaces. There are no defense wounds on her hands. The medical examiner then inspects the victim's head.
At the back of the skull, there is a contused wound which has bled. Moreover, it can be attributed, like all contused wounds, either to a blow or to the body striking a blunt object, the faucets, for example.
No other wounds are visible on the body. The medical examiner ends his external examination by noting that the victim's face, nails, and limbs show signs of cyanosis.
These elements indicate that there has been respiratory failure.
While studying the victim's lungs, the medical examiner finds out what caused the asphyxiation. The presence of water in her organs proves that Michel Laforge drowned.
The cause of death was drowning, since water was inhaled and filled the airways.
The medical examiner from the Paris Forensic Institute adds that the body shows no signs of electrocution. But this doesn't mean that the hairdryer didn't play a role in the death. It's possible that the victim received an electric shock, a shock strong enough to cause a jolt and throw her backwards. Maybe that was when Michel Laforge hit her head on the faucet before drowning. Only blood tests carried out immediately after death would have been able to determine for certain whether Michel Laforge received an electric shock.
This is muscle enzyme analysis. When there are convulsions and shaking from an electric current, the muscle enzymes will be high, demonstrating electrocution.
No blood sample was taken when Michel Laforge's body was discovered. So it will always be impossible to know if she was electrocuted before she drowned. Jean-Marc, the autopsy couldn't establish the circumstances of the death with complete certainty. Only one thing is certain. Michel Laforge was still alive when she got into the bath, as the water in her lungs proves.
Yes, from time to time, the autopsy can't answer this essential question. Was the death the result of foul play? It's frustrating for the magistrates and the investigators. It makes their job harder. But an autopsy is only one evaluation, one investigative measure among others, which isn't foolproof, as we know. We mustn't expect it to tell us everything.
At this stage of the investigation, the police are certain of nothing. They are considering two scenarios, suicide and homicide. Let's talk first about the suicide theory. How do you think things would have happened in that case?
We can imagine that on the morning, Michel Laforge, desperate, locks herself in her apartment. She spreads out several documents on her bed. She runs a bath. Once in the bathtub, she picks up the plugged-in hairdryer from the washstand. She gets an electric shock. When she's shocked, she bangs her head, faints, and drowns.
But honestly, do you believe it was suicide?
There's one thing that makes me doubt it. The fact that Michel Laforge was found half-dressed in the tub. I find it hard to believe she started getting dressed before killing herself.
Second theory, a third party was involved. Jean-Marc, how in this case would the murder have unfolded?
At this stage of the investigation, it's impossible to answer that question. There's no evidence to indicate which room of the apartment Michel Laforge was assaulted in. We don't know if an object was used to hit her. We don't know if she was simply pushed and got injured when she fell. Only one thing is certain. Her killer tried to make the murder look like suicide.
To find out what really happened, the investigators still have a lot of detective work to do. The crime squad officers decide to return to Michel Laforge's apartment. On December 22, 2011, 9 days after the incident, the police return to the scene of the tragedy with the victim's husband.
Hervé Laforge notices that a jewelry box, which is usually in the bathroom, has been moved. It's found in the living room, but it's completely empty.
All the valuable jewelry has disappeared. The box that contained the jewelry is sealed in an evidence bag. Hervé Laforge then makes another crucial discovery. While rummaging through the drawers of his desk, he notices that an envelope containing about 3,000 euros in cash has also vanished. This was money the couple had saved to buy Christmas presents.
From that moment on, the police changed tack. They now consider that a third party was involved. Since some jewelry has disappeared, it means there's been a robbery. And if someone robbed the apartment, surely they killed her.
The theory of a murder during a burglary that went wrong takes seed in the investigators' minds.
The first thing I thought was, well, that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me. She always had her jewelry and beautiful things. Someone saw her and someone went to her house and boom. That was the first thing I thought of.
On January 4, 2012, 3 weeks after the incident, the forensic technicians once again searched the Laforge's apartment. Their mission? To find signs of an assault.
When we think of homicide, we inevitably think of blood. At that time, a certain number of methods were used. The most famous now is Blue Star, which makes it possible, by reacting with the blood's hemoglobin, to reveal traces of blood which have been cleaned, even if they have been cleaned with the greatest care.
The apartment lights are switched off, and a luminol-based blood reagent is sprayed in the different rooms. Under the ultraviolet lamp, several traces appear.
In the entrance hall, there are traces that react positively on a golf bag, under the golf bag, and also in the grooves of the wooden floor.
The floor and walls in the entrance hall have several stains of various shapes and sizes. These traces, which seem to have been cleaned, are sampled for DNA analysis. The experts then move on to the kitchen.
In the kitchen sink, there's a positive reaction.
Under the sink, Blue Star reveals different stains on a cleaning spray and a small squeegee. In the corridor, several traces appear. They look like streaks and footprints. On a piece of furniture in the hallway, the experts find a candlestick. Several stains are revealed on this white metal object.
Of course, all the objects that have reacted positively to the test will be sampled by the investigators to analyze in more detail, to find out whether these traces that have reacted positively to the test are blood or not.
The crime scene technicians finish their inspection in the bathroom. Positive reactions are observed on the floor and on the washstand. In conclusion, the experts find more traces in the entrance hall. A rough idea of the sequence of events can be outlined.
The police work on the assumption that the altercation began in the entrance hall, that a fight broke out there.
At the start of this assault, Michelle LaForge must have been injured, perhaps with the candlestick.
She was hit with a blunt object since she had injuries on the back of her head.
Then, Miss LaForge would have been dragged into the bathroom.
The perpetrator would then have had the idea of making the crime scene look like a suicide. After, they would have tried to clean up the traces of blood.
There are traces of blood in the sink, which suggest they at least washed their hands in the kitchen sink.
This new visit to the apartment is a turning point in the investigation. The police now know that Michelle LaForge was murdered. They eagerly await the results from the laboratory responsible for analyzing the blood samples and various pieces of evidence. Tests of the samples taken from the stains in the apartment were able to isolate Michelle LaForge's DNA. So we know for sure that she was attacked in the entrance hall and her body was then moved to the bathroom. So according to the police, the sequence of events took place in 2 stages.
Yes, and I would even say in 3 stages. The first was the attack in the entrance hall. The second was moving the body to the bathroom. And the third was theft. Michelle LaForge's jewelry was stolen, and an envelope containing a relatively large sum of money also disappeared.
In the eyes of the investigators, the murder weapon could be a metal candlestick which reacted to Blue Star. But strangely, the test revealed that there was no blood on this object. How can this be explained, Jean-Marc?
This is called a false positive. Blue Star, or luminol, it's the same thing, reacts in the same way to blood as it does to bleach. Since experts didn't find blood on the candlestick, this means it was cleaned at one time or another with bleach. Therefore, this doesn't rule out that it could be the murder weapon.
Do you think, like the investigators, that the theory of a burglary that went wrong is the right one?
When there is a robbery and a fatal assault, we inevitably make a connection between the two. But in this case, it's a homicide that has been made to look like suicide with very elaborate staging. Cleaning the apartment and filling the bathtub with water takes a long time. No, this wasn't a burglary that got out of hand. When a burglary gets out of hand, the thieves have only one thing in mind: to get away as soon as possible.
Especially as staging the suicide also required them to rummage through the victim's personal documents and find the funeral photos and printout.
For me, those photos could only have been chosen by someone who knew the victim, who knew her personal life well, who knew her sadness over losing her mother. It must be someone very close.
The investigators' priority is now to figure out as precisely as possible when Michelle LaForge was killed. The police therefore retrace her steps on the morning of the tragedy. By studying the victim's phone records, the investigators try to reconstruct her schedule and identify anyone she contacted. At 9:20 a.m., Michelle LaForge received a call from a friend living in Aix-en-Provence. She hung up 14 minutes later. At 9:42 a.m., Natalie, another friend, called her on her landline.
I talked to her on the phone that morning. It was almost the holidays. She was preparing for a trip. She had to give me someone's contact details, so that's what we talked about.
At that moment, nothing in Michelle LaForge's attitude suggested the looming tragedy.
She was doing very well. She was in a good mood as usual. I got the impression that she was alone. In any case, I didn't hear any noise or her talking to anyone.
The conversation between the two friends ended at 9:48 a.m. Michelle LaForge cut the call short because she had an appointment with her beautician at 10:30 a.m. She needed to leave her apartment at around 10:15 a.m. However, she took the time to make a brief call at 10:03 a.m. to a Parisian number that was unidentified in her phone book.
The call ended at around 10:04 a.m., so we know that at 10:04 a.m., Mrs. LaForge was clearly still alive. She needed to leave quickly since her appointment was at 10:30.
The police learned that Michelle LaForge didn't end up going to the beauty salon. They also know that she received a call on her cell phone at 10:32 a.m., which she did not answer.
Mrs. LaForge's schedule allows the investigators to pinpoint the time slot of the attack, as we know for certain that she was alive at 10:03, since she was on the phone. And we know that she stopped answering from 10:32. So in principle, the attack took place between 10:04 and 10:32 a.m.
What happened? Was Michelle LaForge surprised by her attacker just as she was leaving her apartment to go to the beauty salon? In an interview with the crime squad, Natalie, the last person to speak to Michelle LaForge, remembers a detail from their telephone conversation.
She told me, "I've prepared a surprise for Hervé. He's going to be very happy. I've arranged a lunch with an old friend of ours. It's been a long time since we've seen him."
Michelle LaForge was planning to have lunch with her husband in the company of a surprise guest. But who is this man? Could he have something to do with the murder? By identifying the last number dialed by Michelle LaForge at 10:03 a.m., the police learned this mysterious guest's name. He's the director of an art gallery in the 17th arrondissement of Paris. The man is immediately brought to the Parisian police headquarters. He says that Michelle LaForge left him a message at 10:03 a.m. to confirm their lunch plans.
When he tried to call her back, she didn't answer. He still went to the meeting spot and tried to find them in the neighborhood. He never found them, and he left as he came, without surprising Mr. LaForge or meeting Michelle LaForge face to face.
The gallery owner is ruled out by investigators. The police continue their investigation by interviewing Michelle LaForge's neighbors. None of them remember seeing her on the morning of the attack. However, some testimonies present disturbing evidence.
Some neighbors claim to have heard, between 12 and 2 p.m., the cries of a woman who was screaming.
They're categorical. They agree that they heard the cries of a woman begging and calling for help.
However, the police are certain that Michelle LaForge was assaulted at least 2 hours before the neighbors heard the screams. So their testimonies are quickly excluded from the investigation. It's now been almost a month since Michelle LaForge died, and the officers from the Paris crime squad are amping up the investigation. However, Nagar, no examining magistrate has been put on the case yet. How do you explain this?
In criminal matters, there are two investigative frameworks that follow each other chronologically. First, there's the investigation carried out by the public prosecutor, and then there's the investigation conducted by the examining magistrate. So the examining magistrate hasn't been put on the case. The investigation led by the public prosecutor is still underway. In this case, we're still at the beginning of the procedure, and the public prosecutor has chosen, as he can, not to refer the matter to the examining magistrate yet.
Why, in your opinion, does the prosecutor prefer to work alone with the police officers?
The main thing these two investigative frameworks have in common is the search for the truth. The investigative measures, whether carried out by the public prosecutor or by the examining magistrate, must ideally lead to the truth. But there's also a notable difference. It's only within the framework of the examining magistrate's investigation that a suspect can be indicted and potentially placed in pre-trial detention. Therefore, from the moment the public prosecutor comes across a suspect, the scope of his investigation is limited, and he must pass the torch to the examining magistrate. And in this case, with no suspect in sight at this stage, the public prosecutor undoubtedly thinks that he can continue to supervise the investigator's work himself.
The investigation continues. The Parisian police now focus on checking the statements of Michelle LaForge's loved ones. They study their alibis and follow up on any discrepancies. And this is how they soon discover a new lead that turns the investigation upside down. The police check the various witnesses' statements by tracing the location of their cell phones on the day of the incident. and they make a particularly interesting discovery about Lamia, the Laforge's maid.
It's discovered that Lamia's phone was traced at 10:43 a.m., very close to the Laforge home.
At 10:43 on the morning of the murder, the Laforge's maid's cell phone activated a relay antenna at 72 Rue Saint-Charles, 160 yards from the crime scene.
This phone record shows that she was in the neighborhood. It doesn't show her exact location, but it does show that she was in the area surrounding Mr. and Miss Laforge's home.
At 11:04 and then 11:08, Lamia made 2 phone calls. Location tracking shows that she was near the Duplex metro station at the time. The investigators think she must have taken line 6 to reach her home in the 13th arrondissement of Paris. From 11:33 a.m., her phone is indeed located near her apartment. At the very beginning of the investigation, Lamia explained that she was not working on the day of the murder. So why did she go to the Laforge's neighborhood? The police bring the maid in.
Lamia explained that she did go to the 15th arrondissement. She went there not to work for Mr. and Miss Laforge, but to put up commercials offering her cleaning services to other people.
The police take her to each of the stores she claims to have visited.
And it turns out that no storekeeper recalls seeing her. Above all, there's no sign of these commercials that she allegedly left with the storekeepers.
The investigators now get the feeling that Lamia has been lying to them all along. What is she hiding from them? What did she actually do on the day of the murder? The police decide to let the maid leave their headquarters without informing her of their suspicions. They want to fine-tune their case before taking her into custody. On January 17, 2012, almost a month after the murder, Lamia is arrested at her home at 6 a.m. She's immediately taken into custody. The police ask her to empty her pockets and they proceed to search her purse.
That's when they realize that she has a card from a store that buys and sells gold and jewelry, which pays in cash for jewelry.
Why is the maid interested in this store? The investigators immediately think of the jewelry stolen from Michel Laforge's home on the day of the murder.
The police dispatch a team there straight away. They find out that Lamia went there at 2 p.m., the day Michel Laforge died, with jewelry for sale.
The store's purchase log confirms that just a few hours after Michel Laforge's murder, Lamia sold 1.3 ounces of gold jewelry. This coincidence is more than just a little disturbing.
Lamia tries to get herself off the hook by explaining that it wasn't her employer's jewelry. It was a mistake. It was her daughter's jewelry. At no time did she steal Miss Laforge's jewelry, and she certainly didn't sell it.
Under the fire of questions, the maid continues to deny everything. At 9:30 p.m., the police put an end to the interrogation. Lamia is taken to a cell to rest. The next morning, her police custody is extended, and at 9:15 a.m., her interrogation resumes. The maid then promises to tell the truth, the whole truth.
She admits that she did go to Madame Laforge's home to work there on December 13th.
Lamia says she arrived at the apartment at around 10:30 a.m.
She came normally, as planned, to clean the apartment. She knew that Miss Laforge might be there, so she rang the bell to signal her arrival, to avoid invading her privacy and causing embarrassment.
Without any answer, she opened the door with her set of keys. Lamia remembers hearing Michel Laforge's cell phone ring when she entered. The police believe this was the 10:32 a.m. call.
She saw Madame Laforge's bag, so she thought Mrs. Laforge was there. She called out, "Ma'am, ma'am," while walking around the apartment trying to find her.
Lamia was surprised by her employer's silence. She looked for her everywhere.
When she entered the bathroom, she saw a mass submerged in the water. It was a body.
Lamia immediately recognized Michel Laforge. She claims that she was afraid, very afraid.
She didn't get any closer. She was paralyzed because the person in the bathtub wasn't responding.
The maid continues telling her story to the police officers by describing her state of panic. She rushed out of the bathroom and went into the different rooms. as if looking for something or someone. That's when she saw the jewelry on the dressing table.
She took the jewelry on impulse, without considering the consequences.
At the end of her confession, Lamia's only explanation is, "I don't know what got into me."
It was shining. I was like a magpie. I helped myself.
The police want to know why she didn't call for help when she couldn't have been certain that Michel Laforge was dead. "I was afraid that someone would show up and say I was the one who did it," is Lamia's only answer.
Then she went back to her neighborhood. She went home and took care of her kids before selling the jewelry and depositing the money in her own bank account.
Lamia admits to stealing the jewelry, but she denies any involvement in the murder. The police continue their interrogation until 9:55 p.m., but the maid doesn't change her story.
From the moment Lamia's custody ends, the police officers and the examining magistrate's minds are made up.
On January 19, 2012, the maid is indicted for theft preceded, accompanied, or followed by violence resulting in death. Lamia is then placed in pretrial detention at the Fleury-Mérogis Women's Jail. From her cell, Lamia protests her innocence. But as we've seen, Jean-Marc, the examining magistrate and the crime squad investigators are convinced of the opposite. In your opinion, what incriminating evidence is there against the maid?
Well, she was inside the apartment in the time slot during which the crime was allegedly committed. She had the keys to the apartment. What's more, she didn't stop lying throughout the entire investigation. She claimed she wasn't there that day. She claimed she didn't steal the jewelry. She claimed she didn't sell the jewelry. So, faced with this pack of lies, the magistrate thinks she's hiding something important and is involved in her employer's murder.
In the maid's purse, the police found the card of the store where she sold the jewelry. It wasn't very smart to hang on to such incriminating evidence.
No, it really gives the impression that Lamia is not the queen of concealment. So it makes me think she doesn't have the skills to make a murder look like a suicide with that amount of care and sophistication. But you know, even the most seasoned and hardened criminals sometimes make serious mistakes, and all the better for us.
Lamia says she arrived at the Laforges' house at around 10:30 a.m. She even claims to have heard the employer's phone ring at 10:32 a.m. At 11:04 a.m., she made a phone call near the Duplex metro station, a 5-minute walk from the Laforges' home. Do you think, Jean-Marc, that she would have had the time to argue with Michel Laforge, kill her, stage everything to make it look like a suicide, and finally meticulously clean up in barely half an hour?
It is indeed very short if she arrived at 10:30 a.m. as she claims. But remember, Michel Laforge's last sign of life was at 10:04 a.m. That's when the last phone call she made ended. However, there's nothing to say that Lamia didn't arrive a few minutes after that phone call. So the available time is no longer half an hour, but an hour. And that changes everything. It's not the same thing at all.
In search of evidence, the investigators go over Lamia's personality with a fine-tooth comb. They study her life and interview her friends and family. At 37 years old, Lamia has a clean criminal record and is completely unknown to the police. Born in Tunisia, she's been living in France with her husband for 15 years and raising her 5 children.
She didn't go to school much in Tunisia. She can't read or write French. She speaks it and understands it. She only had a basic education. She moved abroad in search of a better life. She made a living from cleaning as a means of social emancipation. Emancipation from family life. She got strongly attached to her work.
Lamia had been working for the Laforges for 4 months. A regular job twice a week, cash in hand.
Lamia always said that she had a good relationship with her employer. It was going well. She was pleased.
The investigators questioned Lamia's other employers. Their testimonies cast a shadow over this portrait of a brave and respectable mother.
Everyone paints a rather negative portrait of Lamia, saying that she's unreliable and has a habit of stealing. But she's also capable of scheming to get money from her employers or friends, and she never returns the money. This is confirmed by her own husband, who says he's perfectly aware of this negative opinion the people around her have of her.
The police imagine the sequence of events.
They consider that Mrs. Laforge found out about one of Lamia's thefts, and when she realized, there was an altercation that day.
An altercation, a fight, an unconscious victim dropped into the bathtub, and a death disguised as suicide. Then a careful cleanup of the crime scene. The police are sure Lamia is guilty. They don't have any physical evidence yet, so they are eagerly awaiting the latest results of the evidence analysis. The report from the laboratory comes in. No fingerprints or DNA from the maid were found either on the hairdryer, the jewelry box, or the macabre photos. But Lamia's lawyer quickly understands that these negative results won't change anything during the investigation.
It's chilling. One of the investigators explains to us that there's no physical evidence, none of her DNA, but it can only be her for one reason. She was the only person at the crime scene. It can't be anyone else.
But on February 20th, 2012, a month after Lamia is indicted, an anonymous letter arrives at the Parisian police headquarters. This letter shakes up the investigation. The writer accuses a man called Christophe, who on December 13th was at Mrs. Laforge's house. For Lamia's defense, this new lead offers real hope.
Her reaction to the anonymous letter was, finally, we're getting to the truth.
Quickly, the police identify the man accused in the anonymous letter.
This Christophe is well known in the 15th arrondissement because he has inserted himself into Mr. Laforge's group of friends. He pretends to be a trader, offering all the friends, including Mr. Laforge, very juicy financial investments.
The fake trader swindled several of the Laforge's friends, but neither Hervé nor Michel Laforge gave in to this man's tempting offers.
This letter explains that the infamous Christophe was present on December 13th alongside Lamia on the day of the murder, and so it accuses him of having something to do with Mrs. Laforge's death.
Checks are carried out to see if the scammer and Lamia know each other, and it turns out they don't at all. They have no connection, and there's been no telephone contact. At no time were their phones in the same place. Without a doubt, they're not connected and they weren't together, at least not in the apartment that day.
Investigations into this individual don't provide any evidence connecting him to the murder.
Obviously, he has an alibi. Obviously, he wasn't there at the time. In any case, there's no doubt that he has nothing to do with this case.
Fingerprints and unknown female DNA are collected from the letter, but the writer can't be identified.
It's a bit like people were using Michel Laforge's death to try to settle unrelated scores, just to complicate the case a little more.
Lamia continues to protest her innocence.
I'm innocent. I didn't kill her. I stole from her, but I didn't kill her. The first time I met her, that's all she told me, because I asked her to be quiet, because I wanted to read the file before she told me her story. She told me, I promise you, I stole from her, but I didn't kill her. Her story never changed.
Her lawyer keeps repeating that there is no physical proof of her guilt. However, the examining magistrate sends the maid before the Paris Assize Court. On October 25, 2014, almost 3 years after the incident, Lamia appears before the Paris Assize Court. At the end of a 5-day trial, she's sentenced to 18 years in prison. However, there's no confession or material evidence of the maid's guilt in the case file.
No, but the investigation revealed a whole pack of lies on Lamia's part, and the lies carry weight for the jurors at the Assize Court. What's more, there's another crucial element. Lamia was at the apartment in the time slot when the crime was committed.
During the trial, Lamia's lawyer insisted that an illness prevented his client from carrying heavy loads. He claimed that she was physically unable to drag and then lift the body up to put it in the bathtub, at the risk of triggering a serious hemorrhage.
Yes, one regrettable thing in this case is that no reenactment was organized. It would have made it possible to verify different people's statements and check whether Lamia could have dragged her employer's body to the bathroom.
Something else worked against Lamia. When the body was discovered, the apartment was locked and there was no sign of a break-in.
Yes. According to Hervé Laforge, there were 4 sets of keys. His, which he used to open the door. His wife's, which was in the keyhole inside the apartment. Their grandchildren's, which was in its place in a drawer. And Lamia's. But you should always be wary of statements from someone who has just discovered his wife's body. There's inevitably a very significant emotional shock, and his memory may be confused. He may have been mistaken when he said the door was locked.
Very soon after being convicted, Lamia decides to appeal this decision. Her second trial opens on April 11, 2007, before the Bobigny Assize Court. The wife and mother has been incarcerated for more than 4 years. 4 long years during which she has never stopped saying she's innocent.
Every day, her detention is an ordeal, an unbearable weight on her shoulders, and she's depressed. That's the first impression she gives, depressed.
For this new trial, the defense receives unexpected support.
I got a phone call from Michel Laforge's sister, who told me, "I think Lamia is innocent. I'm convinced of it. You convinced me at the first trial. It's scandalous that she was convicted."
Ever since I saw the file, I've been uncertain, and I keep telling my niece, stealing isn't proof of killing. For me, I don't care who it is, but I want it to be the right person. That's all I care about.
Why did Michel Laforge's relatives decide to support Lamia?
I've read the file in its entirety 3 times. I'm convinced she didn't do it. She could not have.
Since the first trial, Michel Laforge's sister and daughter have delved into the case file. They believe that they have discovered serious discrepancies in the police investigation.
My aunt and I expressed serious doubts about the maid's guilt because there was something that didn't add up. What didn't add up was the staging, which was extremely thorough and precise. You could even call it a set design.
Virginie Blaireau, Michel Laforge's daughter, is convinced that Lamia was incapable of making the murder look like a suicide.
In the office, on the corner of the table, was a document from a funeral home, and that's where the problem lies. The maid can barely speak French.
The investigation established that Lamia can't read or write. It therefore seems impossible that she could have selected the documents on display in the victim's apartment. And that's not all.
On top of that, there were photos. How could she know about my sister's life? My sister hardly ever saw her. My sister wasn't going to tell her about her life.
Who are they kidding? It's unbelievable. It's just completely crazy. In fact, they found the perfect suspect, and then they led a one-sided investigation. So yes, the maid didn't call the emergency services for my mother. Yes, she lied and she stole, but that doesn't make her a murderer.
When the appeal trial opens, Michel Laforge's family are determined to make their voices heard.
We were convinced that if we didn't take action, we were heading straight for a miscarriage of justice. And that just couldn't happen. So we fought.
Hervé Laforge, still convinced of Lamia's guilt, is stunned by this dramatic turn of events in the early hours of the trial.
The sister and the daughter implored the court to acquit the defendant. I clearly remember their strength, begging the president, the court, the assessors, the jury, in short, everyone, to acquit the defendant. There was no room for criticism. We were surprised.
We had the advantage that the president of the Bobigny Court of Appeal was curious. He, too, didn't hesitate to point out the discrepancies in the investigation because he quickly understood that he couldn't rely only on the case file, which was too empty.
The witnesses come up to the stand one by one. The testimony of one of the first firefighters on the scene attracts the full attention of the president of the Assize Court. He says that when the body was discovered, Michel Laforge's right arm was not completely rigid. The assessment of a medical examiner is then requested.
The president asks him the question, could this prove that in fact she died later at noon, for example? He replies very clearly, it's becoming a possibility.
And so the medical examiner completely revised the time of the murder. He was no longer looking at the possibility of 10 a.m., but rather between noon and 3 to 3:30 p.m. All of a sudden, we could only think of the neighbors who heard a woman begging. It's shameful. It's just a scandal.
The investigation established that Lamia left the Laforges' neighborhood well before noon, so she couldn't have committed the crime in this new time slot.
We don't need a lawyer. We don't need anything. We understand right away. The investigation was botched. There you go. That's for sure. There are things beyond understanding.
I'm not saying I understood everything. Far from it. It isn't my job to investigate. But in the face of such incompetence, such inadequacy, I can only point out all these mistakes and add them together and see a huge mess.
On the final day of the trial, Thibaut Cotta is the last to speak to defend his client. It's a serious moment because the assistant public prosecutor has just requested a 15-year prison sentence. The defense lawyer decides to plead not guilty by coming up with a very surprising theory. According to him, Michelle Laforge died accidentally.
It's a possibility. We know that when she hit her head, she was already partly dressed. She washed her head because she was bleeding slightly. She picked up the hairdryer to dry her hair before going out. She took off her blouse to keep it dry. At that moment, with her hip problems, she could have slipped and fallen into the bathtub and never been able to get up out of the bathtub.
The jury listens as the lawyer makes his case.
What makes me say this is the hairbrush under her in the bathtub. It suggests that she fell with the brush into the bath, and the brush slipped under her as she fell.
After this defense speech, the jury retires to deliberate.
The accident theory. Why not? It was discussed. The experts refuted it.
We were terrified until the moment of the verdict. I was uncertain, and I couldn't say whether the trial went well before the final verdict.
The jurors return to the courtroom. Their decision is made. Lamia is found not guilty of the murder of Michelle Laforge.
When the verdict was announced, I felt a lot of emotions. It was very intense, and it still is, because this victory always takes me back to losing Mom. And there's also a sense of pride. Helping to free an innocent woman is a big victory. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. No one thought she'd be acquitted.
Lamia is sentenced to 3 years in prison for the jewelry theft. Having already served 4 years of pretrial detention, she regains her freedom on the evening of the verdict. But before returning home, she must go back to the Fleury-Mérogis jail to pick up her belongings and sign some papers. When she leaves, her fellow prisoners show her exceptional support.
The door opens, and she comes out to applause from the prison. The inmates make an unbelievable amount of noise. They whistle and hoot and applaud and basically allow her to leave the place a little more like the woman she used to be, despite the 4 years she spent there.
Lamia is innocent. But then, how did Michelle Laforge die?
For me, the accident theory is completely ruled out. This was definitely murder. The murder lead is the only one to follow.
Michelle Laforge's sister resolves to do whatever she can to ensure that the killer is one day identified.
I'm not going to let go. I'm not going to let go.
Negar, Lamia's appeal trial was very surprising. The active and vehement support of the victim's family seems to have been decisive. Is it common for the civil parties to support the defendants?
This can sometimes be seen in cases where one parent is accused of killing the other parent. So the children have a kind of emotional conflict of loyalty that drives them to support the defense. For example, in the Jacques Viguier case, the law professor who is accused of killing his wife, or in the case of Jacqueline Sauvage, who is accused of killing her violent husband. In both cases, the children supported their parents. But in a case like ours, where there is no family connection between the different parties, it's extremely rare for the civil party and the defense to join forces. In general, when there's a defendant in the dock, the victim's relatives, understandably because of their grief, are extremely vindictive and want the severest sentence to be handed down.
Immediately after Lamilla's acquittal, Michel Laforge's sister started a fight to get to the truth. How, legally, should she act to revive the case?
Since the culprit has not yet been found, Michel Laforge's sister will have to file a complaint as the plaintiff for a new investigation to be opened. But she would have to do it while prosecution is still possible, meaning before the statute of limitations runs out. And the statute of limitations, which starts from the Court of Appeal's verdict, has doubled since the law passed in February 2017 and is now 20 years.
Michel Laforge's sister decides to search for something that could revive the case. She delves into the investigation file to get up to speed with all the elements that haven't been exploited by the investigators. To try to figure out who killed her sister, Monique Poitier goes over all the file documents one by one.
So I get started, and I do as I imagine a detective does. Every day I annotate, take notes, reflect, and try to dig deeper.
In this painstaking investigative work, she's supported by her husband.
As my wife asked me, I went over the file in detail. A number of topics could be described as more technical, but often they're matters of common sense.
The couple takes a keen interest in the testimonies of the neighbors who heard screams. They read and reread the statements of the residents of this small 5-story building.
These are testimonies that no one has taken advantage of. At the SE's court trial, even though these people could have been subpoenaed, they weren't.
A neighbor on the 5th floor said she heard women screaming between noon and 2 p.m., which lasted between 3 and 5 minutes. On the 4th floor, just above the Laforge's apartment, a teenager claims to have heard a woman screaming at 12:10 or 12:15 p.m. Below the Laforge apartment on the 2nd floor, a student hears between noon and 2 p.m. female screams and a loud scraping sound.
This young girl lives below. She says she hears something like scraping. And the scraping, when you think about it, could only be the wooden floors being cleaned.
Michel Laforge's sister and brother-in-law imagine a scenario very different from the crime squad's. A first attack that occurs before Lamilla's arrival. The killer then puts the unconscious Michel Laforge in the bathtub before leaving the apartment. Shortly after, the maid arrives and discovers the body. Contrary to what she thinks, Michel Laforge is not yet dead, just unconscious. Panic-stricken, Lamilla leaves the apartment. Around noon, the killer returns to the crime scene.
For a while, I thought those screams happened when someone came back to clean up, which makes sense, and this person thought she was dead.
Michel Laforge would then, according to her sister, have regained consciousness.
When my sister heard someone coming, I thought she was calling for help, help me. But these turned into screams of fear, and now I understand. I understand that my sister saw the person who killed her. This person told her they were going to kill her.
Who could have a grudge against Michel Laforge? Above all, who had the means to enter her home except the maid? Eyes now turn to the only other person with keys to the apartment, the victim's husband. The Bobigny Assize Court explained its decision to acquit the maid by alluding to uncertainties about Mr. Laforge's schedule on the day of the murder.
It's true that in the document that sheds light on some of the deliberations, it's written that there are questions regarding Hervé Laforge's schedule. It's not only that, by the way. There are other things. Anyway, there's no question. Hervé Laforge arrived at the clinic between 8:45 and 9 a.m. He met with clients until around 1 p.m. He never stopped receiving his clients, operating, and being constantly busy.
Thanks to this alibi, the police officers quickly rule out the veterinarian from the list of suspects. However, according to Virginie Clarion, the relationship between her mother and stepfather should have been looked into more deeply by the investigators.
I'm surprised when I hear some people saying the couple had no problems. I was never questioned. No one was interested in what I had to say. But I have things to say, and I know the couple's private life. I know my mother's private life. I know Hervé Laforge's private life.
A friend of the Laforges has agreed today to discuss the tensions within the couple. She prefers, for professional reasons, to remain anonymous.
I knew the couple well. I had already known Michel for a very long time, and Hervé Laforge since they got married. I witnessed scenes where they were constantly getting angry. They never agreed. It was tense all the time. I thought, when did they love each other? When were things good between this couple?
And it would seem that the vet suffered from these incessant conflicts.
He was under Michel's control. She ruled everything. She was a ball breaker, that's for sure. Hervé had a hard time of it, but Hervé didn't externalize anything.
And for a few years, the veterinary clinic's financial difficulties had been making their lives a misery.
So in my opinion, that was terrible for their relationship, because there was a lot of money at stake, which Michel sometimes spoke to me about. They went through very worrying times, and there was a lot of tension between them.
Since Hervé Laforge wasn't a businessman, his business collapsed. And then he got into debt, and they were forced to sell their country house in Normandy. Their financial situation was precarious.
Despite appearances, was the Laforges' marriage on the verge of falling apart?
At the end, Mom was spending weeks at friends' houses in the south of France by herself. She had mentioned to me that she wanted a divorce. In any case, she was seriously thinking about it.
I thought, Hervé is a pressure cooker. The day he explodes, wow, what's going to happen? I thought, someone's going to get punched in the face.
Could the umpteenth argument between the couple have led to the tragedy on Tuesday, December 13th, 2011?
It's disgusting that people can imagine that Hervé may have been involved in his wife's death. It disgusts me. Hervé Laforge is the kind of man who wouldn't lay his hands on anyone, especially not his wife. No, it's unthinkable. They argued, they bickered, but that's par for the course for everyone. That doesn't mean he kills his wife. No, it's appalling. Everything points to the fact that he definitely wasn't on the scene.
But then why did Hervé Laforge's cell phone activate 2 separate relay antennas on the morning of the murder? Why, if he didn't leave his clinic, was his cell phone traced to 2 different places?
The neighborhood where the incident happened is known for having a lot of cell phone activity. It's likely that one antenna was overloaded and handed over to an antenna a little further away that could handle a user. From what I've seen of the vet's location tracking in the neighborhood, it's completely normal network behavior, which doesn't prove at all that he was somewhere else than where he claims to have been.
Hervé Laforge was never in jeopardy during the investigation. His alibi was verified with statements from the clients of his clinic and from his assistant, who claims he didn't leave that morning. There are no charges against him today.
Hervé Laforge has started over, personally and professionally. He's living a normal life with his new wife.
I can't say who the perpetrator of this crime is. I wasn't there, and I don't have the evidence in the case file. I have the file we all have, and I don't see any evidence to point the finger at Mr. Laforge in any way today.
Since Lamia's acquittal in April 2016, the investigation into the murder of Michel Laforge has been closed. No more investigations have been carried out.
It's difficult psychologically for a public prosecutor who has fought to find someone guilty. Then, after 4 years, this person is ultimately found not guilty, and the investigation has to start over. I think it's difficult.
Ever since, Virginie Cléo has been fighting to get the case reopened. Almost by chance, she thinks she has discovered a new piece of evidence that could revive the case. She remembers very well that winter evening in 2016 when she opened the box of her mother's clothes that she had kept since her mother's death.
Then, as time went by, she wanted to try on her mother's clothes to see if she could wear any of them.
I was very attentive to the smells, to what I saw. It was full of memories. It was a treasure chest.
Among these clothes, a sweater attracts Virginie's attention.
When I instinctively grabbed this sweater, it was obvious. I immediately matched it with the pants that Mom was wearing on the day she was murdered.
For my niece, a light bulb went off. Her mother practically always wore it when she was wearing the pants she had on when she was found in the bath.
Strangely, she notices stains on the garment around the chest and wrists. She then hands it to her dry cleaner, who, without hesitation, tells her they are bloodstains.
I can't imagine my mother keeping this blood-stained sweater in her closet. It's just unthinkable.
According to Virginie Cléot, her mother was wearing this sweater during her fatal assault, so it's a crucial clue, unknown to the investigators until now.
For me, she was wearing that sweater, and I have it. It's in a secure place, and I'm keeping it available for the court.
If it were proven that it was Mrs. LaForge's blood on it, that would be a very strong piece of evidence to get the prosecutor's office to resume the investigation.
Today, Michelle LaForge's family is demanding DNA testing on this sweater. The killer's DNA could be on this garment. Do you think, Jean-Marc, that it would be useful to have Michelle LaForge's sweater analyzed?
Well, yes, it's quite possible that the killer's DNA is trapped in the fibers of this garment. Remember, Michelle LaForge's body was found in her bathtub with her bra raised above her breasts. It may be that her killer accidentally undressed her while moving the body. I think that with the evidence we have, we can reconstruct the scene in the following way. The killer hits the victim violently in the head. She falls motionless to the ground. The killer stands behind her, grabs her under the arms and drags her from the entrance hall to the bathroom. While dragging the body, the sweater is pulled up until it's perhaps in the culprit's hands. This is how the bra also comes up, and it also explains the earring on the bathroom floor, which would have clung to the threads of the sweater.
A mystery remains. How did the sweater end up with the rest of Michelle LaForge's clothes collected by her daughter?
If this is the sweater that Michelle LaForge was wearing on the day of the assault, the killer found the sweater in their hands, folded it up and placed it with Michelle LaForge's other belongings. It's the perfect hiding place for this piece of evidence.
Virginie Cléot told us that she has carefully hung on to this sweater, but for now the justice system doesn't seem interested in it. Why, in your opinion?
When there's an acquittal, it's always a failure for the public prosecutor who, convinced of the defendant's guilt, didn't succeed in making the jurors share this conviction. It's then, of course, very difficult to start an investigation from scratch after thinking the case was solved.
According to Lamia's lawyer, Michelle LaForge could have died accidentally. He explored this idea during his defense speech at the appeal trial. Jean-Marc, what do you think of this theory?
No, there are too many things that don't fit with an accident. For this theory to be taken seriously, how do you explain, without the intervention of a third party, the bloodstains from Michelle LaForge's body being dragged from the entrance hall to the bathroom? How do you explain the documents on display in the victim's bedroom? How do you explain the bra pulled up above the breasts? How do you explain the earring that fell on the floor? Finally, and most importantly, why would she run a bath for herself when she only took showers? No. This woman's death is obviously the result of foul play.
The justice system's mission is to leave no crime unpunished. Why is it doing the exact opposite? I need to know why my mother was murdered and who benefited from the crime.
There's only one thing on my mind: who killed my sister, how they killed my sister, and for that person to go to prison. The rest doesn't matter to me.
Michelle LaForge's family is fighting to get the case reopened.
I believe that all the new evidence is in the file. The justice system has a duty to investigate.
Do I think the witnesses still have things to say? Yes, certainly. I know they do. And there are many of them. I know they're ready. They want to help, but they're afraid. Like me, they're waiting for a new investigation to give them a voice.
There's acceptable death, and there's unacceptable death. And this one is unacceptable. It came at a high price. I've paid very dearly. My husband and I paid very dearly, from a health perspective. I won't let go. Whatever price I have to pay, if you like, it might be pretentious, but it's like I'm a vigilant.
I hope your report will lead to this case being reopened and stop the justice system from hushing up this horrendous crime.
The murder of Michelle LaForge destroyed her family. The violence of the crime is compounded by the absence of an answer. That's why unsolved murders are so cruel for the victims' loved ones. Today, Michelle LaForge's daughter is determined to uncover the truth, for her mother and for herself, and undoubtedly so that one day she can see the killer stand accused in court.